I love Fire Emblem. I've been playing the series since the Blazing Blade, the first one to make it to North American shores. And as much as I like the series, I probably couldn't name 3 characters that aren't the lords from any of the games. Usually half the roster sits on my bench with me looking at them like,
"Hey Flash, I'd love you to meet my friend. Darling, I've forgotten your name."
But as much as I'd like to talk about Fire Emblem's forgettable characters, on today's episode of GBU Reviews, I'll be going over the changes Fire Emblem has made over the years that helped make it one of Nintendo's flagship series, some of the old design choices that are clashing with the new direction, how I would have expanded player freedom by loosening class restrictions if I were on the design team. And if you're upset that I'm choosing this topic instead of ragging on Fire Emblem for its repetitive characters, then have I got a video for you.
Which one is Marth? Marth.
But watch that one after this one. Please? I'm happy to see that Fire Emblem has become such a popular series in North America, and I've heard a lot of different opinions as to why that came to be. Sadly, way too many people like to attribute it to the inclusion of stuff like this.
I wish you could have seen me when I was on stage, wearing jewels and silks every night.
I'll admit that Fire Emblem Awakening's time-traveling storyline, where the characters you married determine the children you got, that used the romance systems well. But I'm still generally not a fan of the romances in the series because none of the characters are well defined. They're all just one trait, like being the crazy one. So you get stuff like this.
I can't believe you made me love you. Of course, if you back out, I'll murder you in your sleep.
It also means everyone has to be in love with your avatar, despite them being a bland, blank slate.
Girl is interested in me, and I'm not going to ignore it.
If I want you,
You want me to what?
I
Forgot what you're gonna say. Happens to me all the time.
So I choose to believe there's more than horniness driving game sales, especially when Fire Emblem actually has really good tactical gameplay. My stance makes a lot more sense when we look at how the series has changed over time. When I started playing Fire Emblem, every game needed its massive cast of mostly pointless characters because the series was known for permadeath. We needed a slew of hapless fools to sacrifice so we could beat the harder chapters.
Do you dare enter the cave of the single trap? Which of you brave knights will enter first?
Probably him.
Very well. They don't call me Mortimer the Expendable for nothing.
You also needed the wider cast because each character had a single progression path. Thieves upgraded into assassins, fighters into warriors, archers into snipers. It felt bad having to decide if I wanted to run an assassin because I liked the class, or bench the character for no reason other than because I hate you! The game's bloated roster helped mitigate that. You'd usually have duplicates of each class to ensure that you liked at least one of them. Next, in the old games, there were no side quests. If your strong characters died, or you got to a chapter that needed a strong archer, but yours was stuck at level 5, you were just screwed. Save scumming was almost a necessity. Unless you wanted to replay an entire level again, your only option was to turn off your Game Boy before the turn ended, so you could still use the resume feature. And you had to be quick because random crits could one-shot your favorite character at any time. So of course, back in my day, only hardcore strategy game players were attracted to the series. It was pointlessly punishing, and we loved it, because it was fun. Not everyone understood the appeal, so Fire Emblem had a hard time drawing players in because they'd look at the fan base and go,
What the hell are you doing? I'm kicking my ass, Demon!
But now let's look at how Fire Emblem has grown over the years to expand its audience, where once you had mandatory permadeath, you now have it as an option when starting a new game. Side quests have been added to the game with varying difficulty levels, which means it's now possible to grind and get your weaker members to go from this,
Oh my god, he's gonna kill me.
to this. We also don't have to worry about save scumming anymore because the game gives us the ability to undo a limited number of moves per battle. And all of those changes make it way easier for a wider audience to enjoy the series without preventing the veterans from playing in hardcore mode. You'll notice I skipped one of the things from my list. The flexible upgrades, because this is where Three Houses has brought the innovation. In this game, your avatar is a professor at the monastery, which means you're responsible for teaching all of the students. You get to decide who learns swordsmanship, spellcasting, horseback riding, and more. And there's an auto-instruct option if you don't care to spend time teaching.
I do not care about biology. We're not going to do any biology in here. This also won't be one of those things where I end up learning more from you than you do from me. I know more than all of you combined, so that doesn't make any sense.
The students all have an affinity for specific skills, but you can finally craft your army and focus exclusively on the characters you like with more control than ever before. You can teach them in special one-on-one sessions during class, assign them to tasks around the monastery to train their skills, or have them participate in things like choir practice to improve their skills. Beyond that, each student has up to 2 goals, which you get to set, that they'll work towards improving every week regardless of if you spend the time with them. So all of your characters are making improvements no matter what you do. And with 4 story paths to explore, there's plenty of chances to replay and learn all about the characters in the game, if you're interested in that. On one hand, it's nice that Fire Emblem is finally letting me treat the characters as generic soldiers to be molded however I want. I get a sense of power being able to look at them all like,
"You are not special. You are not a beautiful or unique snowflake. You are the same decaying organic matter as everything else."
The problem is, Fire Emblem is far too intent on sticking to its class system, and it causes a disconnect between what my character has learned and what they can do. There's nothing wrong with having a class system in the game. In fact, I like them. They decide your character's stats as they level up, and as you master a class, you can unlock special passive abilities. Classes are great. In the original games, classes were used for defining a character's strengths and weaknesses. Generalist characters tend to warp strategy games, so designers have to carefully craft the tools they give players to maintain the balance.
See, he's got to have a weakness because everybody's got a weakness. I mean, for what? Pandora, it was the box thing. For the Trojans, hey, they bet on the wrong horse, okay? We simply need to find out Wonder Boys.
A sword master was fast and could only use swords, so they were weak to durable spear wielders. This is because Fire Emblem's combat used to revolve around something they'd call the weapon triangle, which is a misleading name, but it's effective to understand because everyone's familiar with rock, paper, scissors. Swords beat axes, axes beat lances, lances beat sword. Easy, right? But then you add in the different spell types, which made their own triangle, and bows, which are effective against flying champions, and then there were hammers and other specific weapons for killing heavily armored enemies. In Three Houses, the weapon triangle isn't a set-in-stone rule. Instead, you have to teach your character's abilities like Sword Breaker, which will make them more effective against swords. I like this change because it feels like your soldiers are specializing at fighting against specific enemies rather than just having a built-in advantage. Although it does mean sometimes it's harder to know who could have an advantage in a fight.
He's the snake to my mongoose, or the mongoose to my snake. Either way, it's bad.
But, bringing this back to my thesis, it makes me question the strict adherence to the class system. What I mean by that is, let's say I have a character. I've trained them in black magic, white magic, spear, and horseback riding. If I make this character a holy knight, they'll be able to use the spear and white magic in combat while riding their horse. But for some reason, they won't have access to their black magic. And it's not like you can make an argument that there's something in their armor that prevents them from casting spells. They can cast all the healing spells just fine. If we take the same character and make them a Valkyrie class, all of a sudden they can cast both black magic and white magic while riding their horse. But that spear they were holding, it's like they've completely forgotten how to use it.
What are you doing?
I'm mugging you!
With that stance?
What?
Like, I love you, Fire Emblem, but giving me control of how to build my characters and then limiting what they can do feels like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. When it comes to game balance, designers will often talk about levers. These are variables that we can tweak to buff or nerf an ability or a character. They're things like stats, how much attack does this sword give? How long is the cooldown of a skill? How much mana does it cost to use that skill? Do you have a limited number of casts or arrows for every battle? Thankfully, Fire Emblem has so many balance levers that I feel decently comfortable suggesting a large alteration to how their core class system works, because I think my suggestion could be balanced if the direction is good. And a lot of game design is doing exactly what we're going to be doing in today's video. We're identifying problems, understanding the root cause of the issue, creating a solution with the hypothesis of why this would fix the issue. Then, normally in a real-world setting, we'd have others audit our work before we create tests and then refine the idea until it's either approved for production or dropped. But that's why we call this section the ugly. I'm suggesting ideas with no data, second opinions, or ideas how the team's dynamic was. The problem we've identified is that the class system leads to a character not feeling like their training matters. There's a disconnect between what my stats say I can do and what my class will let me do. The possible concern with altering the system is we could ruin the balance of the game by allowing players to make god-tier characters. Now, let's get into the hypothetical of how I'd fix this. I'd start by splitting the skills into two categories. Right now, everything a player trains could be used as a class requirement. For example, to become a paladin, characters need to be a B rank at horseback riding and spears. I'd change it so that one category is our weapon traits. Swords, lances, black magic, and all that, those would be removed as class requirements, because they already have a role. They decide what weapons our characters can use and how good they are with those weapons. The rest would be our class skills. There would be 3 movement class skills: footman, flying, and riding. And there'd be 4 armor classes: robes, clothes, light armor, and heavy armor. You'd combine those two to create the various classes in the game. A foot soldier in robes would be a mage. In clothes, they'd be an assassin. In light armor, a mercenary. And in heavy armor, they'd be a general. I've built quick example charts to show how I'd build the classes in my hypothetical Fire Emblem game. As your class skills rise, like riding or heavy armor, you'd gain access to stronger classes, going from basic to master, just like how it is in Fire Emblem now. As you can see, I'm not cutting the amount of classes or adjusting the class tier system, because those weren't part of our stated goals for this update. We're just trying to make the classes weapon agnostic. So you might be asking, how could this be balanced? Well, just as it does now, each class would grant different stats to characters as they'd level up. So even though we're giving players the freedom to make a character that can do it all, realistically, there's only so much they can do before the end of the game. So the more you spread your character out, the worse they'll be. Putting points into magic will make your physical attacks weaker and vice versa. There might be exceptions like wielding a magic sword, but in general, if you're trying to train a mage, making them learn to use swords, lances, axes, and bows is not helpful. Next, just like in 3 houses, each class has a special skill that you can earn when the class is mastered. So again, there's only so many classes you can play before the end of the game. You have to choose which you want each character to master. And finally, Fire Emblem isn't afraid to limit players with a slot system. In 3 houses, you can only equip 5 of your mastered abilities. You can only carry 6 items. You can only equip 3 combat arts. So if it really becomes a concern that players can infinitely swap between their weapons, I'd change a character's inventory to have dedicated slots. So each character can only bring 3 weapons into combat, 1 accessory, and 2 consumables. The goal here is to make players really think through how they're building their characters. And if somebody's willing to put the time in to grind for the ultimate character through New Game Plus, I say let them. But hey, that's just me. I've spent the entire ugly section doing a design experiment with you all because Fire Emblem 3 Houses is an amazing game. This was the best issue I could think of making an episode out of. I mean, maybe I could have made a good episode about writing compelling characters and asking that the next game have fewer but more fleshed out characters, but then I'd be directly competing with the Unraveled video.
Here's an archetype I call What the Fuck, and it's the 3 characters that make me say, what the fuck, Fire Emblem?
Seriously, go watch that. Regardless of how the developers choose to keep improving the game, I'm gonna be excited to follow the series along that journey. I just hope we get a little bit less cringe anime stuff, and that one day I can actually build a champion that feels like it's me in Fire Emblem. because I refuse to use the characters that annoy me or the ones that I find useless.
And I've worked ever so hard.
I'm sorry, Lisa, but giving everyone an equal part when they're clearly not equal is called what again, class?
Communism!
Here's hoping that the next entry in the series has some deeper characters with actual story arcs, and that we'll get more than just a few lines of epilogue to try and wrap up their stories.